We have two people online.
Yeah.
We have Linda,
Yeah.
but we can't see Linda and camera. Can we ask them? Can they turn on their camera? Okay, so we're going to quickly start. So a huge thank you to Victor and to Frank for that session. So we're moving on to the second session. My name is Amelia Onyema. I'm not a finance person, as you can imagine, but I'm a professor at the law school. I do international investment law and I'm a disputes lawyer. So I do international arbitration, teach and research, and I sit as an international arbitrator. And so all of this, at some stage, disputes arise. And it helps us as disputes lawyers when we understand why firms go out and what the particular role of the Belt and Road Initiative is all about. So I have a stellar panel. It's not just because they're all females, which is very strange. But I think that my panelists actually work in this field and think through the policy issues. So I'm going to introduce them and I'm going to tell you what we're going to talk about. We're looking at trade finance and debt between China and Africa. And we want to understand whether there's going to be a new approach or if it's going to be more of same. And as we've been told, that it looks as though there's a cooling off of all of these investments that China is been making on the continent. And what we then want to understand as well is looking at the debt distress, and we have the High Commissioner of Zambia to the UK here, and we know that Zambia and China have been in the news for a while now. So she's going to bring that perspective onto our discussions. We're also going to think through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Remember that I told you that I also do international investment law, and we have the investment protocol, which has already been mentioned by Dirk and the work that they are doing. So we're going to also be looking at that to understand whether this would present new opportunities for the way Africa engages with China and the way China engages with Africa for the future. We know that the 2024 Forum of FOCAC just effectively concluded. So we'll try and give you some snippets, insights into what we think how that might impact on the future of this relationship between China and Africa. But we're not going to go into details because we want you to come back tomorrow. And our keynote speaker is going to do a lot more detailed discussion of the outcome of FOCAC 2024. So who are these wonderful Amazons that are going to be discussing this? So we have two of our ladies online. So I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Folashade Sule-Kodo. Now, when I saw her name, I'm Nigerian, if you haven't recognized that by now, which I think you should. I'm Nigerian. So immediately I saw Folashade, I was like, oh, that's another Nigerian. She says, no, I'm not Nigerian. And so she's not Nigerian. So she's not one of the Folashades that is Nigerian. So Dr. Folashade is a senior research associate at the University of Oxford. And then we have, Linda has already been mentioned. She's with the ODI and she's one of the senior research fellows at the ODI. So ladies, you're welcome. I hope you can hear us clearly. If you just say hello to the room so we know we can hear you. Folashade, Linda, can you just say hello? Can you unmute?
Everybody.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you very well.
And we can also hear you. So thank you. In the room, I have, I'm going to start with my far left. And Agnes, I know really well, and we've done work together. So Agnes is Gitau. She's Kenyan, and she's the executive director of the Eastern Africa Association, and she used to be with 3VB, Verulam Chambers, set up Barristers Chambers, which is part of the connection. And next to Agnes is Yunan Shen, who is doctor as well and a research fellow at ODI. And finally, we have Her Excellency, the High Commissioner from Zambia to the UK. Now, I really tried to behave myself with correctly pronouncing her name, so I shall not attempt. I will just describe her as Mrs. Florence Mazoka, because that's the bit I can pronounce. But the first name, I have no clue how it's pronounced, which I think it's fair. Okay, so the way we're going to run our panel is we want it to be discussive. So remember that I'm a lawyer. So if I mess up, it's okay because I'm a lawyer. Lawyers, we mess up and then we can explain what it's all about. But the way we prepared our panel discussion is that we want the panelists to engage. And then we will take questions. But if you have a really, really burning question, just raise your hand. This is a lecture theater and I'm a teacher. Just raise your hand. And if you can't wait, absolutely cannot wait, we will take the question. But if you can wait, if you note your question down, we will call on you to ask questions. If we want comments, we will ask for comments. A question doesn't take up to 30 seconds, which means I will cut you off at 30 seconds mark if it's a question you have. If you want to make a comment, maximum 2 minutes. So you choose whichever one you want and we will accommodate that. We have people online as well, and we will also take comments and questions from colleagues online. So we're going to start, and the very first question that we're going to start with Her Excellency, Madam High Commissioner Mazoka. And we know that Zambia has had some interesting experiences with China. They've benefited. They've also had some serious debts. And we were told that China does not like being owed. And so I think that they do something about it when they are owed. So we wanted you to start with just sort of helping us understand what that relationship is looked like for Zambia.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and thank you to our program chair. The first name is Machenje.
Thank you.
You're welcome. In my home village, they would say Majenje. But for, I guess, Western,
for those from West Africa,
it's Machenje is fine. Thank you for this. This is I think a poignant and very timely discussion and topic, particularly just after FOCAC and also where we are in the world. Very interesting times, very challenging times, and particularly for the continent. So as the professor had mentioned, I had a question that was posed to me that I had to reflect on. And I'll actually read you the question first so you can get a sense of what my remarks are answering. So it was really focusing on what has been Zambia's firsthand experience with Chinese investment, number one. In what ways has it been transformative to the Zambian economy? And how does that compare to experiences with other investment partners? So just, I think, a question for the time, particularly for my country. And also more specifically, because we're just coming out of FOCAC, where there was, I think a lot that was put on the table, a 10-point plan, which of course we will have to unpack and see how that rolls out across the whole continent, because you're not talking about 2 countries across the continent, but 50+ countries. So how that division also happens in terms of attention, I think still is yet to be seen, and the detail is still forthcoming. And they always say the devil is in the detail, but we will take it from there. Zambia's engagement with China really dates back to our pre-independence era. So specifically, Zambia has had a very strong and ongoing relationship. But I think it's in recent decades that the relationship has really transformed the Zambian economy. The construction of Tazara railways in the 1970s was really the early landmark connecting our landlocked nation. Now we no longer consider Zambia landlocked. We say we're landlinked. Landlinked because we have 8/9 countries that surround us. So if you invest in Zambia, automatically have 9 markets to which you can export to. But at that time in the 70s, we were land-linked. So Tazara really helped set the stage at that time to, number one, the whole point was us to connect to Tanzania's coastline. And that really set the stage for China's growing role in developing Zambia's infrastructure. Ironically, my father used to run the railways back in the 70s. He went to university in the United States in the 60s. It's part of the first wave of Zambians who kind of went out post-independence to be educated and come back. And at that time, if you really think about most of our Africans, during the 60s and during that transition, they were young. 20s, 30s, young, vibrant, vibrant time of Africa's development. And I remember when Tazara was built, and it was such a big thing for the country because it allowed us to export, to import much more freely, because some of our borders were being curtailed by what was happening in, at that time, southern Rhodesia. Zambia used to get bombed. I remember we used to have to turn off our lights at night. That was during the Ian Smith administration. And of course, what was happening in South Africa. So that blocked another channel for us getting in resources and sending out resources. So I have vivid childhood memories of our relationship with China. I remember when Mao Zedong passed away. Dr. Kaunda was leading the country at the time. We had 7 days of mourning. Yeah, I remember that because Dr. Kaunda was very big on protocol, and when a friend passed away, a comrade, you acknowledged it. We had, I think it was about 7 days of mourning. So that means, no TV, you stay, it's just, yeah, that's how it was. Just because of the friendship that the Chinese had with Zambia and how much of an investment they had made in the country. So since the late 1990s, as China really emerged as a major global investor, we've seen significant Chinese involvement across multiple sectors in our economy. The purchase of Chambesi copper mines in 1998 by a Chinese state-owned enterprise marked a turning point, spurring increased trade between Zambia and China. By 2006, China accounted for about 10% of Zambia's exports, up from a negligible amount just 8 years prior. Chinese investment has particularly been transformative in infrastructure development, roads, bridges, airports, power plants built by the Chinese financing have really dramatically improved Zambia's connectivity and energy capacity. And we're actually having much more deeper conversations around that, particularly with the climate issue that we're facing now. Our region is suffering a horrible drought. We're really not doing well in that regard. From a governmental standpoint, plans were in place for economic development. This was with the new administration that just came in 2021. Things were a little bit challenging, of course, because of the debt issue that we had with China and our other creditors as well, legacy issues. Those were being worked on. And then came the drought. And that really hammered us, not only us, but we have Malawi, you also have Namibia, you also have Zimbabwe. So yes, quite a bit happening in that regard. So these projects have not only enhanced our economic competitiveness, the ones with the Chinese, but they've also created jobs and opportunities for Zambians. But it is important to note that our relationship with China, like any economic partnerships, comes with both opportunities and challenges. The issue of debt, that has been mentioned, has been at the forefront of discussions in recent years. As of 2022, China held a significant portion of Zambia's external debt. As was mentioned, we've had ongoing and very long, exhaustive, but positive at the end of the day, because we have to come out of this positive conversations and negotiations around debt. And it's because it hasn't just been with the Chinese. Our debt has been with a myriad of different players. So, of course, people want to know, how are you negotiating with the left hand? Are you negotiating the same with the right hand? And so it had been a bit of a challenge, but we are getting there and things are looking very good, actually. This FOCAC, it's really highlighted, I think, some of the shifts in Chinese investment and what they plan to do and their patterns, not just with Zambia, but with other nations. More increased investment on some key areas that I think are more forward-thinking, not for just us, but globally, where we have to go, green energy projects, digital infrastructure, et cetera. Aligning both China's domestic priorities and Africa's developmental needs. But the keynote tomorrow is going to really give you, I think, a more in-depth look into that and unpack what happened at FOCAC. And I wish I could be here for that. So I'm going to have to log in. I think I will, because I know her well and she does excellent work. So you're in for a treat tomorrow. That's a plug. We are also seeing a greater emphasis on private sector involvement, which is critical, and particularly for Zambia, that is one of our key economic strategies. We really want to bring in foreign investment. We really want to work with the private sector because we know private sector means more jobs, manufacturing, more jobs. So again, businesses coming in and investing in Zambia. So it was good to hear that, that more Chinese private sector businesses could be coming into the country. But again, with the challenges, then the countries who are the receiving countries have to be just mindful in terms of terms, in terms of what the benefits are, that they are mutually beneficial agreements. I think that's where we have to be a little bit more careful as we move forward. And not just with China, even with the United States, even with the UK, all countries that we negotiate with, particularly as the continent, because the continent has been carved, shaped unfairly over myriad of years. We have unnatural borders that don't serve our people well, because our borders have been historically mountains, rivers, et cetera, those that are natural borders. So a lot of issues are still playing out. Comparing Chinese investments to our experiences with other partners, there are similarities and, of course, some differences. So like Western investors, Chinese firms seek return on their investments more so. However, China's approach has often been more aligned with our development priorities, particularly when it comes to infrastructure. The speed of project implementation and the willingness to take on large-scale projects have also been notable advantages of Chinese investment. They've taken on the big ones. That's why I think you'll find a lot of African countries, when they want big problems solved and quickly, they'll go to China because the response is quicker. And no one can fault anyone for that. Every country is sovereign, and you have to do what you have to do to help your people grow and develop. And it should not be conditional that you have a relationship with that you do not have a relationship, say, with the China or Asian countries vis-a-vis the West. We're in a new day of global development, and we need to be, I think, thinking along those lines, that sovereign nations shouldn't be held to, that old adage, well, your friends are my friends and my enemies are your enemies. No. So having said that, we recognize the importance of diversifying our economic partnerships Zambia does continue to engage with traditional Western partners. There are great friends as well. Multilateral institutions and emerging economies to create a balanced and resilient economic strategy. It's really about creating win-win relationships and strategic relationships, which actually was the term that President Xi mentioned. Strategic partnerships. And there's a lot in that one word. And I think it really helps provide some clarity on the direction of the kinds of relationships that now China is looking to have with Africa, because strategy is a strategic relationship is far different than just a relationship. So looking ahead, Zambia is committed to maximizing the benefits of Chinese investment while addressing the challenges, because yes, there are challenges and we can't bury them under the rug. We just have to deal with them face on. We're focused on ensuring technology transfer. That's critical for us. Increase local content in projects, so beneficiation, and aligning investments with our national development plans, because every African country has their own plans. The continent has its plans. It was also good to hear that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area was mentioned and discussed. Agenda 2063 was also discussed, because those are areas where we know there's been consensus across the countries, or the majority of the countries at least. So partnerships should start there, where we know that there is agreement. And then you can get into the bilaterals level. But at least from the broader sense, I think a roadmap is already there. The recent establishment of multi-facility economic zones with Chinese support offers promising opportunities for industrial development and job creation. We have some in Zambia, and that's great. So in essence, Chinese investment has been a significant economic driver in Zambia. As we navigate through the global, the evolving global economic landscape, we do remain committed to having a beneficial relationship with China and others. So I think that kind of would wrap me up for now before we move on to the next.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think I want to turn to Agnes, because what I hear is a reset of relationships. I hear of we need to separate politics from economics. So you can have an enemy that is your enemy, but the money can keep flowing. What I hear from Your Excellency is that African countries are beginning to think from a needs perspective. What do we need? I know that you're not prepared to answer the big C question, but that's a major part of the equation. So at some point, I'm sure we'll come back to that. But turning to Agnes, having heard all of this, and I'm not sure you were in FOCAC, you're not a government official. So most of this you're also hearing for the first time, which is great. But turning to Agnes, where does East Africa stand, and what's that relationship like? I know you have a specific question, and I'm broadening it out.
Thank you very much, Prof. And it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Derek, Angela, and the team at SOAS for hosting this, and all the other partners involved. I work for the Eastern African Association, so my day job is to support international and regional businesses looking to do business in our part of the world, so the Eastern African part and the Horn of Africa. So really supporting them with market entry, guiding them navigate the sometimes difficult terrain in that region. So in regards to China, Prof, I wasn't in FOCAC. I also am one of the Africans who cannot understand why so many of our heads of states had to all go there. I was hoping that FOCAC, I think, should be held in the continent, maybe sometimes. But looking back and really listening to Ambassador Mazoka's opening remarks, China-Africa relationship, and I think has had bad PR because we look at government to government. When you look at Chinese private sector, we've seen quite a number of businesses, private Chinese companies coming into the continent. According to the World Economic Forum, there are about between 3,000 to 8,000 private companies investing and doing business in the region. And they're investing in critical sectors that are important for us in the agriculture, infrastructure, and most importantly, telecommunication, which has really helped the continent grow. And what we see, a good example from my country, Kenya, is the Chinese investment in the Safaricom. So we're seeing Chinese companies partnering with African companies, either joint ventures or collaboration, and that relationship moving beyond just mere trade to joint ventures, collaborations, and co-investing in some of the projects. So, I think you pronounce it as Huawei, has invested in one of Kenya's main telecom provider, Safaricom, providing innovation infrastructure for financial services, providing services for a lot of Kenyan women and men who are unbanked. So financial inclusion, promoting also economic activity. In Nigeria, maybe moving away from one of the significant industrialists is Dangote, who everybody knows. We've seen Dangote is working closely with companies like Africa in the cement projects that are operating in Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. We've also seen a new investment of $400 million in truck. So again, Dangote working with a big company in China. Others are I think it's called Transsion. It's a telecom company that has understood the African market needs. So African mobile users need a mobile phone that will last them, because has long life battery. Also dual SIM, right? So it's called Techno, Infinix. I'm sure you've seen all these brands. And so what these companies have done, they've understood and studied the consumers, understanding what they need and providing products that match the consumers' need. And another observation for us is that Chinese companies are also responding to the bad PR around governance and compliance, and are now beginning to engage and understanding the importance of sustainable businesses, right? Another observation, again, from the East African scene is the Chinese venture capital or private funds supporting tech startups in the region. You know how difficult it is for companies to access financing. So WapiPay is a good example, and other tech companies that promote cross-border payment. We've seen investment of Chinese funds. So they are innovative, they are ambitious, and also they're willing to take risk. And I think the advantage of these companies for me is they align their investment firstly with their Chinese government's direction. So they have the support of, they follow the bilateral relationship and follow Chinese, and so they have the support of the government. Also access to finance. And I think Frank in his keynote highlighted that they have access to finance, so they're able to take on big projects, the big infrastructure projects, the mining sector projects. And the challenge for African businesses, and I guess it's a challenge for policymakers, is to ensure that we support African businesses so that they have equal access to finance. And I think that's a discussion for another day of how difficult it is for a lot of our businesses to access finance, so that they can benefit and they can also match as equal partners with these big Chinese companies. Again, the importance of seeing more encouraging Chinese private sector in the region is because it is long-term. Governments have come today, and after 5 years, they're gone, right? So when you see private sectors in the region, of course, you create jobs, government don't create jobs, but most importantly, we see it as a long-term investment, right? The other point probably I wanted to highlight is the importance of understanding the values of African consumers. And I think that's something the Chinese businesses have understood better than most Western companies that are in the region, understanding what the consumers want, their values, the cultural values of African businesses. And so therefore they tend to get favorable access if you compare to other companies. But of course, it's early days, and I guess as we navigate the geopolitics, as China looks explodes with the new US election, as China looks at the geopolitics, it will be important to see how we can leverage, or how African companies can leverage on this the trade dispute, or the tariff issues between the US and the China government, but also the EU and the regulations, and take advantage of that to ensure that there are opportunities for our private sector to engage, but also to learn, and most importantly, to find ways of accessing finance. And I'll respond to the other questions on to the specific in regards to East Africa and whether they are competitors or how the partnership can be developed as we go along.
Perfect. Thank you so very much for now. I think you raise really important positive relationships between the Chinese private companies, African private companies. I was recently in Abuja, and some Chinese private firm was launching longer time solar batteries and inverters. I think the key point, going back to telephones, looking at what the African consumer actually needs and providing those in partnership. I like the idea of the joint ventures and in partnership with local African companies, because of course we need to think of how do you transfer this. And maybe to that extent, and this is actually a question which we might be interested in your views and comments. Is this a new form of, I don't want to use the word I never can pronounce it right, but this is SOAS. So we decolonize everything. and so we have to mention the word. Is this a new, I had said reset of relationships. Is this a new way? Is it a relationship of equals or seeming equals? Or is it the good old 18th, 19th century North-South nature of relationship? And that's something for you to think about. Any good teacher would give you an assignment. And so that's something for you to be thinking about while I move on to Yunan. And Yunan is going to pick up on trends, and she's going to help us unpack some of the lending practices of Chinese financial institutions, and looking into your crystal ball, what you can see in relation to that, please.
Thank you, Professor Amelia. And just firstly, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to my colleagues at ODI and to the team at SOAS for organizing this. Obviously, as we've all discussed, a huge and very prominent aspect of China's economic engagement in Africa has been through the virtue of its official financing flows, primarily coming from policy banks and development banks, and in support often of its contractors and enterprises in going out, not just to Africa, but to the broader global south as well. I think we need to understand China's overseas lending in that respect as a reflection of its domestic economy and its domestic economic trends. This is a time-contingent phenomenon that really began in the mid-2000s and took off particularly after the global financial crisis. This was a product of its trade imbalance, its very abundant foreign exchange reserves, and a political impetus at that time to offshore some of these capital surpluses to better returns, as well as finding a means to promote its firms in going out and in building markets for Chinese goods and technologies. But of course, China's economy now is not where it was a decade ago when we really saw this boom. African economies are also not in the same position. So in terms of the trends that we've seen, there's really been a transformation, I would say, along three axes. First, in scale, in modalities, and of course, in some of the sectors and priorities of cooperation. First, in scale, as I said, we really saw a boom beginning in the sort of post-global financial crisis era. But that is a boom that is really come to the end of a cycle. The transformation really begins after 2015, when China loses a quarter of its $1 trillion reserves. And really after 2017, in the face of growing regulatory pressure, a slowdown in China's domestic economy, and a growing risk aversion as well coming from China's financial institutions, the capacity of Chinese banks, both policy banks as well as commercial banks, to provide that scale of financing is a lot tighter than it used to be. Also bear in mind in this era, we see several cases of debt distress, of projects that have gained a lot of negative press as well. The myth of the debt trap emerges around this era. And really, I think COVID-19 and the pandemic and the shock of the pandemic, particularly for African borrowers, kind of closed the lid on that phase. We're going to see now, I think, a resurgence in lending, but a much more disciplined, a more selective and a more strategic orientation in how Chinese actors provide financing, as well as, of course, for African borrowers, a much more strained capacity to be able to absorb that external capital. And with that, I think we've also seen a shift in the modalities and sophistication in which Chinese financial institutions and financial actors provide financing. And I want to give a shout out to a new ODI report that will be coming out with the collaborator Tianyi Wu sitting over there, which looks at actually this growing diversification of Chinese financial institutions. Particularly after 2015, we've seen a growing participation of commercial banks and commercial actors in supporting infrastructure in Africa. And as well as new, more innovative ways of mitigating and managing some of the risks that these infrastructure projects entail. And so I think going forward, we're going to see more of this kind of diversification, more experimentation, and a shift away from this kind of vanilla style bilateral sovereign lending to other modes that involve more of these private commercial actors through uses of syndicated lending, through co-financing as well with other third-party or regional financiers. And one recent trend, I think, that we've seen in as well in recent cases of lending is this trend of on-lending as well to African regional financial institutions. So this practice of on-lending, we could interpret also as a form of risk mitigation, but it's also a win-win as well for African financial institutions that are very much in need of this capital as well. And I think a final point to conclude on is on the sort of sectors of priority. And when we look at China 10 years ago during that boom, what was being constructed was very much heavy infrastructure, these areas of China's domestic overcapacity in concrete and steel and in big construction. Where we see the areas of overcapacity now in China's domestic economy, as our keynote speaker pointed out, is very much in these frontier technologies. In Professor Franklin's presentation, he pointed to this prominence of renewable energy in solar PV. And so if you look at these trends of where China's economy is going, I think that also points to where the future priorities and possibilities of cooperation lie.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yunan, for helping us see the big picture. And so the way I understand what you've said is that we're getting grown up and maturing relationships between China and Africa and the lending practices, and the ability to move as the global economy and the bigger picture, things around climate change, as those issues become important, the nimbleness with which we can also move, but retaining that relationship. I like the idea of the on-lending because, of course, that creates depth in the African financial market as well. So thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those issues. We're now going to move online. As you remember that we have two wonderful Amazons online. So I'm going to start with my half Nigerian sister, who is not a Nigerian, which is Folashade. So I'm going to ask Folashade to please explore for us, how African countries currently negotiate in their negotiation with China, and this whole idea of infrastructure projects, bearing in mind what Union has just told us on that move away from heavy infrastructure to frontier technologies. Falashade, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank the hosts and organizers for having me, though virtually. I've very much enjoyed different presentations so far. So when it comes to the negotiation practices, as many of you know, when infrastructure negotiations, there are very often two contracts. When there's a loan involved, there's one for the loan and the other one more specifically for the infrastructure project itself. So everything related to construction, to employment, and so on. Can you hear me?
Can you speak a little bit louder?
Sure.
If that's possible, or is
Yes.
that our room? Can we make it louder here, in here? But please go on.
Okay. So when it comes to these negotiations,
I think we can hear you better.
Great. So
Great.
how African countries are negotiating these projects with China? Of course, there are variations from one country to the other, but some of the common patterns that I've observed over the years is that when there was at the start of the renewed engagement by China in Africa, the different ministries and different agencies were not quite ready. There was not enough, I would say, internal technical capacity and knowledge of China, of how China also has evolved over the years. And this was mainly due to the fact that at the negotiation table, China was, or the Chinese side of the negotiation table was very much composed of both political and capital interests, so business interests. Whereas on the other side of the negotiation table, on the African side, there were more technical experts, civil servants, and sometimes politically appointed diplomats and so on. So that created already an imbalance at the negotiation table, and I've written on this in a few articles. So how has this evolved over time? Over the past years, there have been some changes. The relationship has evolved. It's multi-phased. There are many different sectors involved as well. As I tend often to quote a diplomat, China has become hyperactive in Africa. And so knowledge and in-house expertise on China has also progressively evolved in the African capitals and in foreign ministries. While some countries like Ethiopia, and I'm thinking to some extent also Rwanda, have this internal China desk that coordinate activities with Chinese companies and Chinese officials to some extent as well. Other countries have also increased their internal capacities. In West Africa, for instance, I've seen improvement at several levels. There's been a better association of China-trained experts in the negotiation. So many Africans who have been to China in the past, they are more associated than they used to. Before the period I was mentioning earlier, the negotiators were very often trained in, in let's say France or the UK. So they didn't have this business knowledge of China. And so this is a bit less the case today. However, an African negotiator who speaks Mandarin and has more or less good knowledge of Chinese business culture is not necessarily enough to get a better deal. So it may help in easing dialogue at the negotiation table, but it's not necessarily what will secure the best deal. So what is needed in addition to that is development of very more permanent pool of in-house expertise, especially China is Africa's biggest trade bilateral, for many countries, a bilateral partner. So when it comes to negotiations and infrastructure negotiation, there is still room for a better negotiation agenda, on infrastructure. And that is not only at the national level, but also at the regional level and in mining deals, by providing better monitoring schemes, equipping local leaders with better capacity, enhancing internal legal expertise, and also when it comes to environments and other standards. That is important because something that I observed is that in several countries, there is procurement of external expertise, but on a case-by-case basis. And so this does not necessarily allow for a more sustainable strategy when it comes to bargaining with China. Also, I think it is important to set up, a better agenda on infrastructure project, not only at the bilateral, but also at the regional level. And another element that I've observed more or less is that knowledge is still not always distilled from the senior officials to the younger ones, to ensure this perenniation of negotiation skills and best practices from one generation of negotiators to the others. So those are my comments. I would just a final note on this is that Agnes was talking about the geopolitics, and this is important to mention. African governments are becoming more and more pragmatic. They are aware of the geopolitical shifts. African countries are being courted a lot by different development partners, whether they are traditional or new partners. So they are increasingly diversifying partnerships. And this also is the case beyond China. You have other strategic emerging partners. I'm thinking of Turkey, India, the re-emerging partners like Russia, but even the traditional partners like the US and the EU that are recalibrating their Africa policy and now also competing with China in Africa. So it's several negotiators from one country to the other use these competing interests to get better deals and concessions from China, thinking about Guinea in the mining sector, for instance. But this is still something that needs to be strategized more and turn into a long-term strategy instead of a case-by-case. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Folashade. I think and I do agree with you, with your views around the African countries, whether as individual countries, but hopefully better at the minimum at the level of RECs, so the regional economic communities, or the AU, to think more progressively around their own needs. And so to go into this negotiations better prepared. And the need to grow and develop trade negotiators is not just as it relates to Africa. Even we've had those running problems, even with negotiating the Africa Continental free trade area. And I hear what you say around geopolitics and the role that Turkey, India, all these other players are performing on the continent. I'm quite pleased to hear that we're getting a shift. I was in Beijing to speak at an event at one of the FOCACs. I can't remember whether it's 2016, 2018, one of those. And there was something from colleagues out of Kenya. And we're asking about how the negotiations was going, blah, blah, blah. And somebody from the legal department of wherever told us a story, which I think, again, something for you to think about, because that is setting the context of and the connection between the politics and the economics. And they had done their preparations, they had draft agreements and all of that. But what was signed was different from what was agreed, what they had prepared when they went to Beijing. And of course, the lawyers were furious. But the simple thing that your former president said is, if you give me $2 billion, I think it was B then, now it's T. But if you give me $2 billion, that's fine. I would take it, but I'm thinking of the electorate, and we have an election coming. And so this is key. It might go towards when these conferences are arranged, when they get these conferences. But it's important for us to also bear in mind, I'm sure, Madam High Commissioner, you would agree, that the politics is not just, this is not just two private companies negotiating a business deal, but there is a constituency that the African governments need to also engage with. I'm sure Madam High Commissioner has a lot to say, but for now, I want to go to Linda. Again, that's your second assignment, something for you to also think about. So Linda, I think for you, we want to also pick up on trends, the trends that you are seeing in terms of trade and investment. Folashade has talked about the infrastructure projects and preparing with negotiators, but what for you are the current trends that you are seeing in the trade and investment space?
Of course. So first of all, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I've already learned a lot from my fellow panelists, so it's great to be here. Trade and investment, these are areas that I work on a daily basis at ODI. So I was really glad to see that they got so much prominence in the discussion in recent years. And also this was sort of sealed at FOCAC, where it was really, there was really a lot of discussion about trade, about facilitating trade from Africa to China, about increasing investment. Now, we're not going to preempt too much the discussion around FOCAC, but I think it's important also to give some, to look at the trends, to give some indications of what has happened. So the first thing that I'll talk about is on trade flows. So we know that trade flows are quite unbalanced between China and Africa. So China exports to Africa a lot more than it imports from Africa. So there's an imbalance in terms of quantities, of scale. There's also an imbalance in terms of what is traded. So Africa mainly exports to China raw materials, minerals, whereas China exports to Africa a much more diversified baskets of goods. Manufactured goods, but also agricultural machinery, industrial machinery, cars and vehicles, and so on and so forth. Now, this, of course, is a reflection of what the blocks produce. China produces a lot of different goods, and Africa really also does, but in terms of exporting is a lot more of these natural resources, agricultural products in some areas. But to China, really the focus on the exports is on natural resources. This is something that African leaders have complained about quite a lot. So, you know, President Museveni of Uganda has been talking about this for years now, that he wants to diversify his exports to China. President Ramaphosa of South Africa, as soon as he landed in Beijing for FOCAC, he basically said, we want to export more South African goods to China. And so therefore, this is something that, you know, has been quite prominent in the discussion, and that China has sort of been listening to and accommodating. So the last FOCAC, we had a sort of target, a commitment in terms of how much, what value of African goods was China going to import. At this FOCAC, we haven't seen that, but what we have seen is a slight expansion of market access for African goods. So before, African countries, the 33 African least developed countries could export duty-free to China around 97–98% of their tariff lines. And now it's been announced that it will be expanded to 100%, right? So a slight increase in terms of what African countries can export duty-free. So this is really to expand African exports to China. At the same time, there's a lot of initiatives to facilitate this trade as well. There's the creation of, green lanes mechanism to export more easily. Electronic platforms have been deployed to increase the transport of agricultural goods from China from Africa, sorry, in particular Ethiopia, Rwanda to China. So there's been a lot of activity and a lot of innovation in this sector. Specifically for agro-processing goods. Now, I think this is quite interesting to consider also in light of China's interest for its own food security. At the moment, China of course requires more and more food, not because of a growing population, but because of a growing sort of buying power of its population. And so far, a lot of this food has been sourced from Latin America and from from neighboring countries in Asia as well, whereas there's not so much food trade with Africa. And potentially, this increase in agricultural imports from Africa is sort of paving the way for a future stronger relationship in this area where, where China enhances its food security as well. So this was in terms of trade. If we, on the other hand, look at investment, I think here as well we see some interesting trends and shifts. Now, China is not, in terms of investment stocks, the largest investor in Africa. It's actually the 5th largest investor. I think this is a little known fact. Everyone thinks that China is the main economic player in Africa, but Dutch companies, French companies, US and UK companies still have the largest FDI stock. But of course, Chinese companies have been very aggressive in investing in Africa in many sectors. We've heard about Safaricom, we've heard about Transsion, and so on and so forth. So we really see a lot of this investment going into the African markets and therefore increasing the stocks very quickly. Now, investment is particularly resilient, and especially at times when we see that maybe policy lending is declining, other forms of finance are declining, investment is potentially gaining importance as well. We know that Chinese companies invest in a lot of sectors in Africa. As Western companies, they also invest in financial sector and in the extractive sector. But they also invest in other sectors that are really dear to the heart of African governments: construction, manufacturing. These really are transformational sectors that create value addition, that create a lot of jobs and have a lot of potential, not only for value addition in the short term, but also for knowledge creation, knowledge transfer in the longer term. And we see that, a lot of this investment has also been incentivized. So at FOCAC in particular, there has been a commitment, a pledge to support African investment, Chinese investment into Africa. So President Xi has sort of mentioned a pot of money that will go towards this support. He has highlighted a few sectors that will be central, and these are really sectors that have been identified and highlighted as important by African partners themselves. So pharmaceutical, agro-processing, transport and logistics, and so on. So we see there that, China is listening in a way to the requests that are coming from African leaders. So in this way, we see a sort of improvement and a strengthening of the relationship. Of course, we need to remember that as it was already mentioned, actually, that Chinese companies are interested in making money as well. So they go where the money is. And in particular, when we talk about investment, when we talk about FDI, a lot of this comes from private companies. Now, the Chinese government doesn't necessarily have a lot of control over what private companies do. They can provide incentives, they can provide support, they give directions in sectors where it would be useful to invest and go out, as we say. But a lot of this investment is not state investment, and therefore it still needs to have that very strong sort of profit-seeking motivation to invest in Africa. So I think this will be, potentially like an important area to look at in the future. Chinese companies still manage to invest a lot in Africa because, as it was said, the risk aversion that they have is probably lower than that of other companies from other countries, from Western countries in particular. And Chinese companies are a lot more used to operating in in a sector, in a context where there's informality in the labor market, or where there's less regulatory pressure in certain areas, and therefore they find it probably easier compared to their Western counterparts to invest in the African context. But overall, the signals that we see for the future, I think, are encouraging. This is not to say that there's necessity for African countries to have Chinese investment, or that we're in any way promoting Chinese investment. Investment from any partner should actually be encouraged and should be welcome. But of course, we see a lot more appetite from Chinese companies to invest in the African context compared to other companies.
Thank you so very much, Linda. One of the goals of the African Continental Free Trade Area is how African raw materials or primary goods, how we can add value so that they can become more finished goods for exports. So I think that it's a good thing that China is also opening up the categories of goods that can come into China. And the other thing, you remember that I said I do international investment law. And so when we talk about FDI stock, that's one form of investment. So it depends on what data you're looking at to know who is the major investor in the continent. And of course, it can also be country specific. Those are areas wherein what's happening in one country would differ from what's happening in another country. The idea, the trend, this whole idea of ensuring that there's job creation. I think Madam High Commissioner and Agnes will be quite pleased with that. And knowledge creation and expansion in specific sectors. I think those are I think I'm happy to hear that that's the future. But that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, of course, is the African countries themselves and the RECs and the African Union on what is or what are the priority areas that would lift the millions of Africans that need to be lifted out of poverty and create jobs for our teeming young population. I think those are the things that exercise. I know that that's one of the major things that exercises Agnes's mind. Remember, I know her, and I've met the High Commissioner, and she's agreeing. I think that's one of the things that she's also concerned about. We want to pause because you've only been hearing female voices. And you might want to hear some male voices. This is SOAS. We are an equal opportunities employer and school. So we would like to take some comments from the audience. I have a couple of questions online, but I'll start from the. Well, it was a male that shot his hand up, and I have all the others are female. Well, and there's another male. Oh, another male. Okay, I think the men are waking up now. Okay, please.
Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. I'm Webber from SOAS, Center of Sustainable Finance. My question, I have two questions. One to Your Excellency. This is regarding the human development aspect of infrastructure development, Chinese-led infrastructure development in Africa. What has been the criticism is that in this development, even the semi-skilled labor capital deployed in the infrastructure has been imported from China. And I literally saw Mason repairing a wall of Embassy of China in Nairobi. So how do you, is this a bargain which China has got? Have you failed in this negotiating that you need to include the local workforce in developing Africa's infrastructure? Is this something which you're deliberately ignoring because you are getting otherwise a good infrastructure which the Western allies never offered to Africa? So China has definitely filled this infrastructure gap. My second question is to Dr. Yunan, is regarding a sovereign debt situation piling up in many economies across sub-Saharan Africa. because the Chinese debt is a bilateral non-Paris Club debt, so it does not have the visibility of negotiations on, and especially a great economic impact like COVID or a war on Ukraine, which leads to more pressure on sovereign situation. How is this debt been renegotiated to ease off the fiscal pressure from certain countries? Because we saw a crisis in Kenya which developed recently when the new finance bill was tabled, and it is also one of the reasons given was to repayment of the debt was so high. I'm not blaming that China alone is responsible for that, but because China's debt is a non-Paris Club debt, it does not come in the public eye at how the negotiations are going on. So would like to learn more about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that just mirrors another question which we had online regarding unskilled labor, where China brings in unskilled labor into the continent. So I think we'll just take that. Yes, we have a lady.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Emily and work in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. I was wondering how African governments balance at FOCAC negotiating as a bloc to get a better deal for Africa, which is better aligned with African goals, versus the sense of competition between different African countries in competing with finance. Are the tensions there? And yeah, particularly interested in the experience from Zambia as well.
I hope you're going to be here tomorrow, because you'll get a very detailed answer to that question tomorrow. But we're going to scratch the surface. Okay, and we have a gentleman. We'll take about 3, 4, 5. Yeah, I have no choice. If my boss says I need to sign. Yes, please.
Thank you for this excellent panel. I'm Leon. I'm an independent consultant. And my question is to the High Commissioner. She said that generally when there are big problems to be solved and this problem has to be solved rapidly, the partner to be talked to is China. Okay. I'm wondering, because in Africa there's so many big problems, but why some problems kind of now could be qualified like urgent or they need to be solved rapidly? Is it because it's part of a national development plan? Is it's because of lack of planning? So I want to understand that. Perhaps if we fix the planning, so we can also diversify the number of partners that we have. And from the partner side, I also want to understand if the Western countries are also getting more innovative in the way of wanting to tackle these big problems that are urgent to be tackled, or to just leave that to be solved by China. Thank you. Okay,
great. Thank you. She mentioned big problems in the context of infrastructure, but I'm sure she would pick that up. Dirk, we have Dirk and then who again? Okay. Let's just be sure we got 3 men. So
we'll be filling the quota. A question about so the relationship is about it's maturing, it's changing, and the High Commissioner also mentioned it. We're learning, and she used the word renegotiation. Mm-hmm. And then the lawyer sitting next to you opened her eyes even further. What did you mean by that? What needs to be renegotiated? Or if you don't want to answer that, perhaps a question to the whole panel is basically, what does negotiation mean for China and in Africa and other countries? So if I think about negotiation in the case of the UK, although I'm not a negotiator, I'm just an electrician, there you would not reveal your red lines at all, and then you would negotiate. But with China, so one trade negotiator in one country said to me, China reveals its red lines and does not negotiate. How do you view, how does the panel view this statement, basically, so that does China negotiate actually, or does it just reveal its red lines? This is what it is, basically. What evidence do you have to refute it or to confirm that?
Okay, so I know we have loads of hands. Let's take this set of questions, and then we know who's raised their hands. We'll come back. And just to pick up for the panel, to pick up on whether power imbalance plays any role in this last question. Should we start with colleagues online? If you take 2 minutes max each, if there's anything you want to respond to. Should we start with Linda this time around? Linda, is that? Yeah, is there any question? I hope you heard the questions, and then you can pick from the ones online as well.
I have. Actually, yes, there's a couple of things that I want to react to very quickly, even though they weren't necessarily addressed to me. So I'll just, react on the basis of my knowledge. There was a question about labor and semi-skilled labor in Chinese projects. It was probably referring to infrastructure, construction projects, and so on and so forth. I think we see trends there also if we need to, identify longer term trends. We know that Chinese construction projects, but also Chinese manufacturing firms and so on and so forth, employ actually a lot of African workers, but very often for the low skilled or so-called unskilled positions. Now, this is a trend that's sort of like decreasing over time as African workers learn about the jobs and learn about the skills that are needed, and therefore this kind of decreases over time. At the same time, this is definitely something that I think should be addressed as a problem. What does it take to, train African workers at the start of a project to, make it so that there's definitely, like, from each of these projects has a certain amount of knowledge transfer and technology transfer. So it's definitely something that, is improving, but more could be done to provide more benefits to African partners. There's also a point in the chat that I wanted to address. It refers to the trade discussion that I raised and the trade deficit between China and South Africa, which was sort of questioned, and the data don't match. Now, this is, so someone sort of remarked that, China says they have a trade surplus with South Africa. South Africa say they have a trade surplus with China. This is something that actually is very, very common with Chinese data. I don't only work on China, Africa, but I've also looked at Chinese trade with Southeast Asia, Chinese trade with Central Asia. This happens all the time. If you look at two countries basically and how they trade, you will find huge discrepancies in their trade numbers. And this depends on a number of things. How is the data collected? How is the trade valued by the customs agencies, and so on and so forth? One thing that I haven't mentioned when I was talking about trade, but which I really want to emphasize here, is a lot of African countries really care about their trade deficit vis-a-vis China. They want to export more to China. I don't think it's necessary to have a zero trade balance with all your trade partners. So I think if you're a country in Africa, what you want is you want to expand your exports. And who you export to doesn't really matter, whether it's China or whether it's another country, whether you import a lot from China, for example, to produce goods that you then sell to another country, that's also good. So what you want is overall like a robust export performance, but you don't just need to have that sort of like zero trade balance with another country. So I just wanted to address these 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. I think that's an important point. Folashade, 2 minutes. Are there any particular questions you'd like to engage with?
Yes, thank you. I would like to touch on the question about, FOCAC and negotiating as a bloc. So I know that tomorrow there will be more in-depth discussions about FOCAC, but I think it's important to mention the regional dimension and the collective bargaining aspects, both whether it's at the summit, but also at the regional level. So there have been improvements also at that level when it comes to agenda setting at these summits. A few years ago, China was still the partner that was setting more the agenda. And what we observed this time at the FOCAC agenda is that it was not only suggested by China, and there was much more input on priority elements to be discussed at different meetings. So there was a stronger African input. But these summits are generally venues for both bilateral and regional deals. And the bilateral will remain an important dimension of this relationship, since many African leaders see these platforms, whether it's China, Africa, Indonesia, Africa, a few weeks before, all these Africa +1 summits are platforms and opportunities for signing MOUs for various infrastructure deals and also other type of deals. We've seen, well, you mentioned Zambia, but also South Africa, Kenya, many countries came also to sign a couple and got a couple of promises and MOU signed. So, and China gives a particular importance to this as well. But I also think that there should be an equal interest in bargaining collective deals at these summits, especially when it comes to infrastructure projects. I'm thinking about digital infrastructure projects that are across countries. And so this would also help increase not only the transparency and but also, you know, increase value addition and maximize gains from negotiations with these different partners, and also local accountability and overall just enhancing the enhancing agency, you know, from the African side of the negotiations. And I'll just end, you know, with a small comment on what Dirk said before on, you know, it's sometimes hard to negotiate with China. Yes, this is true during the negotiation. It is very often, you know, the red lines, it's a take it or leave it approach that is often observed. But that does not necessarily imply that African negotiators cannot try, you know, to bargain. And that's where the geopolitics come in here, because there are also other partners that can be used as, you know, ways of getting more concessions from China, in particular, especially at least when it comes to infrastructure and mining projects.
Thank you very much. And so a huge thank you to Linda and to Folashade. So in the room, let's start with Yunan. And which of the questions, and you also get 2 minutes, because most of the questions were directed at Her Excellency, so she will get 4 minutes to try and see what she can unpack. But there will be lunch, and we're hoping that over lunch, we can continue with the discussions. So we'll start with Yunan and then.
I'll try and be as brief as possible, but it's a very complex topic around how is debt being negotiated or renegotiated. I mean, just to start with, we really lack in the international architecture a structured sovereign debt workout mechanism. So to date, when approaching creditors like China or approaching commercial creditors, it's really been more of an ad hoc, bilateral, case-by-case approach. And we see this particularly with how China behaves in its previous restructurings. It's outside of the Paris Club. And the big problem now is that the Paris Club, you know, formed over half a century between a group of rich world countries who established a set of norms between themselves. But now the world is much bigger, and most of this debt is owed to not just to China, but also to commercial creditors via international sovereign bond issuances. And it's a much more complex creditor mix. So when it comes to Chinese banks and Chinese creditors, they're not inherently that different from other creditors. Everyone wants to be paid back, and they want to be paid back in full. I think what makes Chinese creditors also distinctive at addressing the negotiation question is that there's very limited autonomy when it comes to individual institutions and negotiators from individual institutions. You have issues of personal liability when it comes to bankers within Chinese financial institutions, and there's a tendency to escalate the problem upwards because they don't have the authority to give concessions. And this can lead to quite a rigid and very hard, a hard front in debt renegotiations. And you know, at best, a very prolonged renegotiation process. Since COVID-19, we now have a new framework, if we can call it that, under the G20, which is the common framework for debt restructuring. And in that is trying to get around some of these challenges of this complex creditor mix in order to ensure, as with the Paris Club and the norms of the Paris Club, that creditors are treated equally. And so this was a big bugbear for Chinese creditors, that they didn't want to give concessions if the MDBs or private creditors weren't also taking some pain themselves. And we have had some recent successes and some results coming out of the common framework, as we've seen in Zambia. But that has been still a very prolonged and quite painful process as well, if you are cut out of capital markets for several years. And so I think there's still enduring challenges that can't be resolved easily from borrower sides or from individual creditors, that we still lack this kind of international structure. There's still a lack of trust and transparency between creditors and even within the Chinese system itself. China is also not a monolith. Different financial institutions have different political and financial incentives. There isn't really there isn't the political plumbing, to borrow someone else's words, between Chinese banks themselves, and so that's still in a process of learning, of hopefully transformation. But very happy to discuss this question going forward.
Thank you very much. Agnes, 2 minutes.
Where do I start? Perhaps I start with the importance of African governments negotiating as a bloc rather than when they go to FOCAC rather than as individual countries. I think they realize the importance of that, particularly with the regional infrastructure projects. However, national priorities, of course, will overtake any other regional or continental requirement. I see where we have seen the region coming together. A good example is under the Africa Free Trade Agreement, working together to ensure that there is regional trade development across the African continent. I must mention that China Exim Bank has a stake in Afrexim Bank, which is such a key driver of the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And I think hopefully working to support Africa Exim Bank in their cross-border payment platform, which is meant to facilitate cross-border payment. So that's probably an example we should use when it comes to negotiating, not just with China, but with the rest of the world. I think it's important that as a continent, we actually have a bargaining chip if we come together as a collectively rather than individual countries. Again, around debt, I think it's good to understand that China only owes about 12% of Africa's debt. There's this common narrative that Africa is indebted to China and everybody else is the same. No, I think we need to change that narrative. There needs to be, of course, transparency, exactly how much is owed to who and what's the payment plan. I think Kenyan citizens have been very, very clear in demanding information from government to understand who do we owe and what's the plan for repayment, and to an extent trying to advise the government on how they think the taxpayers should be used towards honoring Kenyans' debt repayment. On access to Chinese market, I think, Linda, you mentioned the Green Lane Initiative mechanism, which I think Kenya and Namibia have benefited from. We've seen a lot of Kenya's avocados accessing China's market. I'm sure there are other, and of course, Ethiopia and Rwanda too. So there are initiatives to try and encourage open markets for African products. Well, AGOA has expelled about 8 countries, right? There are regulations around the EU which will make it difficult for African products to access this market. I think China is learning and observing what the rest of the world is doing and trying to respond and making sure that the relationship to an extent is equal. Around negotiation, I think there's a lot to learn, right? Government negotiators, including the UK, they are usually, I'm sorry to say, but they need capacity and skills. Around local content, I think governments are becoming very clear on ensuring that the local content laws are adhered, not just for Chinese contractors, but also the European companies. Yeah. You see European journalists or marketer or a salesperson getting a work permit to work, and that role can be taken by another African. So it's not just China, right? It is, I think, African government. Its onus is on the African government and also the African citizen to ensure that these laws are there. And some countries have incredible content laws like Ghana and Kenya, but they're great on paper, but it's become very difficult when it comes to implement them. But the narrative is changing, and I think, as Ambassador said, the future is that Africa can trade and work with anyone else. You know, not just China. We don't have to choose who our partners are. And it's important if you're going to develop a continent that all these partners are equally important for the continent. And for me, the most critical sector will be encouraging private sector. So Chinese businesses working closely with African businesses, but also collaborating with other companies to invest in the continent. And that, as you said, Professor, you create jobs, you create opportunities for the African. Thank you.
Great. Don't worry, where the ambassador is ready to answer. 4 minutes.
Thank you. And actually, I don't think I need 4 minutes because the subject matter experts, I think, really covered most of the issues. To be perfectly frank, probably in much greater depth than I could. But what I will do is speak specifically about Zambia, and I think that might lend some assistance. And I'll probably deviate a bit and add some other things too. But I mean, yes, the Amazons have really done it well. In terms of with the labor issue, you talked about, the question was around Chinese labor coming in, the Chinese bringing in their own labor. I think that was answered quite well. The trend seems to be changing in Zambia slowly. It was a major issue in Zambia, particularly in the early 2010s. In 2011, it was a huge political issue. There was a call for the Chinese to leave the country. You know, people on the streets were just saying, oh, there are too many Chinese here, too many Chinese, because they saw that jobs that they could be doing were not given to them. But so I think there has been a responsiveness from some Chinese companies to maybe step back. So that's number one. And also there's a bit of a different kind of relationship between the previous administration that was in country with the current government and the type of conversations that are had with China. We had to stop in 2021 and kind of relook at what was on the table, what kinds of contracts we had with various Chinese companies to look at the balance of trade, if you will. Is it fair and so forth? So a lot of things changed. Our current president has been to China probably 2 or 3 times already to really look at these nitty-gritty issues and form a different kind of partnership. So maybe it's not a renegotiation per se, but it's better negotiating. Better negotiating and looking at terms. And I think across the board, even if you look at the way we should probably look at it as a continent, there's so much value on the African continent. We have the access to the future. We have all the critical minerals that are going to change the world and make the world a more green place, and and really save the world. You have the potential to feed the world. And as a result, I think the mindset as a collective needs to change, and we're seeing some of that. We approach it as a collective to say, no, this is the value that we have. And if you're going to negotiate with Africa, then you have to come to the table with something a little bit better, something that leaves something on the table for our own people. So in terms of some of the opportunities that are there for locals, and specifically from a Zambia perspective, there have been some changes in policies, changes in terms of how local businesses, how Zambians are more empowered. So if you're a foreign investor coming in, you can partner more easily with a Zambian company and get some incentives. So that's one way in which we're trying to also ensure that Zambians are far more empowered than previously before. So you don't always see investors coming in or and kind of driving it completely and leaving locals out. So promotion of JVs, et cetera. In terms of and thank you, I think that you addressed it around the running to China to fix big problems. It was really just more for infrastructure, because they have the history and the wherewithal and I think a track record of doing big infrastructure projects quickly and well. So you go to who can give you the best deal and the best service. And that has been, I think something that I don't think anyone can really deny. but again, that's specifically, I think, more so for infrastructure. In terms of Western countries, are they getting more innovative in terms of the way in which they approach African countries and or Zambia? I think, yes, some projects are much more aligned to developmental needs. It seems like there seems to be much more of a willingness to be responsive. And I say a willingness. I always say willingness because until the rubber hits the road and we see how it happens, we don't know. The United Kingdom, as an example, the new administration here is coming forth with a different language, specifically bringing up things as such as we want to be less paternalistic in terms of how we engage. We want to have more strategic partnerships. So again, the strategic partnership, that word, and for Xi Jinping to bring up strategic partnership, that has to be unpacked. What do we mean by a strategic partnership? So, I mean, watch that space. Watch that space because it was kind of highlighted, and that means a lot. You know, what is the difference? You know, what does that mean? Because when something is strategic, there's much more thought that goes into it. And so, but we also have to think of, okay, if it's strategic, whose strategy is going to be, you know, met? So we really have to be careful of what that means. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much it because I mean, our panel, the other panelists did so well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. I know you're all hungry, but be patient with us. We still have a few more minutes to go. We have quite a lot of questions online. And my bosses have said I need to take or at least mention some of those questions. So we had questions around migrant workers and we've answered those. And somebody, the person who asked the question had picked up on the experience of Namibian mines, but we've answered that questions. And then again, we've answered the question around strategic approach to engaging with China and ongoing geopolitical competitiveness, comparing China and Western countries. We've unpacked that. I like this whole idea of our new government here in the UK talking about strategic partnerships. And then I think of what happened with Rwanda and the refugees, asylum seekers, refugees, all of those things. And the conversation I had with the Attorney General of Rwanda. And I know that colleagues here in SOAS work in Rwanda a lot and around development. And that was a very thorny period between our colleagues and colleagues, the government colleagues in Rwanda, because it made zero sense. But again, it goes back to what do I need? What is of importance to me? And we must not forget that these are governments and these are liberal democracies that can be voted out of power just because too many people are crossing the channel, whereas everybody knows who the people smugglers are. And nobody seems to think that that is a way of dealing with the situation. So I am a lawyer. I'm not into politics. We also had questions around how Zambia's plan to leverage its natural resources, and then we also had around clean energy, and we've mentioned that. We have questions around consumer demands and issues around development. We've also sort of touched on those. So hopefully colleagues online, you would note that we do notice, and we looked at the chat and we picked up on your questions. I'm going to, I know that Hong, oh, you're fine, great. Thank you, you're a good boss. Anyway, so it's time for lunch. I've been asked to remind you that our next panel, I'm going to conclude on what we discussed, but our next panel is going to be looking at, we'll delve a little bit deeper into infrastructure interactions between China and Africa. And so what we have done, our panel is looked at trade, investment, and debt. And we've sort of, we've opened up the canvas Frank started with his strokes, we have added the outlines of that as it relates to trade, to investment, to debt. We've picked up on quite a lot of issues and we've given you examples. So we're expecting that you should be talking. It's not good manners to talk when you have food in your mouth, but you're exempted. We expect you to engage with these issues. Colleagues online, apologies that you have to get your own lunch, but we would go and have lunch and keep talking. We expect you to be seated here latest 2:05. There will be coffee as well to keep you awake for the afternoon session. 2:05, you should be seated. We will start on the dot of 2:15. Thank you very much. Can you please thank my panelists?
Thank you so much.
I'm in a different team. I work in
You are a high level. Oh, it was lovely. It was lovely to show. Yes, I nice to see you.
Staying for lunch?
No, actually, I mean, back for dinner.
Yeah. Yes. We'll see. Yeah.